We will edit this together. And it'll be great. People won't even know. This is 2 streams. It'll be 1 stream. If it works. I hope it will. Sorry for everybody that lost us in the first half. You can't change the settings in YouTube without stopping the stream. So in an effort to get this to work properly, I had to start a new stream with more latency, and I bumped the quality down a little bit. I can't help the internet I have, so we are going to do what we can. I don't know anything about the URLs or anything. Hopefully it works. But anyway, we could jump back in. So I feel like we talked about Electro Notes pretty thoroughly there. Yeah. Maybe a few more things about it. Electro Notes. So you had mentioned guest writers in Electro Notes and some of the guest authors that had published. I know Don Buchla published work in Electro Notes, and I think Bob Moog as well published a few articles. So if you're interested, it's certainly worth looking up. And I know someone said in the live chat that they're not taking orders currently. Maybe take a look at your local library if you live in a larger city, or ask around on the web. Someone might be able to sell you their copy or lend you their copy for reading.
Sure.
I know if you live in the Pittsburgh area and you wanted to read a copy of it, someone could certainly borrow my copy, all 3 boxes of it, because it's definitely interesting reading. So I feel like we've got sidetracked here a little bit.
Yeah.
What would we talk about next? You mentioned very briefly David Tudor. Now, the only reason I bring this up is I find this David Tudor...
I'm very thirsty, apparently.
Yes, I find it mildly fascinating, and there's not a lot of information about David Tudor out there. And I'm sure everyone here would like us to talk about oscillators and envelope generators, but there's plenty of time for that stuff. So let's talk a little bit about, and the reason David Tudor is interesting in the context of me speaking to you is you have spent a long time researching David Tudor and doing a lot of work and going really deep into his art and specifically his electronics.
Yeah.
You want to tell me a little bit about that, and I'll stop talking now?
Well, his work is really... What's interesting about Tudor, even if you never liked his music, is that he devoted himself to learning electronic music and creating a set of instruments for electronic music at a time starting roughly in the late 50s or so, where there basically weren't any tools. And so he started sort of cobbling together, teaching himself electronics from popular magazines and fooling around with amplifiers and microphones and creating gradually in tiny little boxes, some of them literal soap dishes, small instruments that he would connect together to create a music that he thought made sense. His first career was as an organist and then as a pianist doing avant-garde piano music with John Cage and John Cage's Circle, and he was the premier avant-garde pianist in the world for roughly from the late 40s to early 60s. And gradually moved away from what could have been a very successful career to start making this music nobody cared about. And just the dedication that he showed to studying and building and being very open to sounds, and imagining new electronic music that didn't necessarily sound like clean oscillators and controlled pitches, not just sort of souped up electronic realizations of 17th century music. Like one of the problems with the theremin was that they always demonstrated it by playing Bach, which is sort of odd. You have this very new instrument that can do these beautiful smooth glides, and the first thing that they try to do is make it not glide. Right, and play this music that it depends entirely on very precise pitches, instead of sort of embracing what was unique about it. And Tudor didn't do that. He made music that let the spirit of electronics sort of speak for itself, mostly through feedback. So he would create these large networks of all these little boxes I described, and interconnect them in ways where they spoke for themselves, like creating these rich, noisy, animal-like timbres, hard to control. I just thought that was a really beautiful idea, to sort of spend all your energy making instruments that were going to do their own thing. In a way, there's a kind of an anonymity about him. Like, he was an incredible performer, but his personality was like, he always put himself, there was nothing boastful about it in a way, which I think was interesting. It was a big inspiration for me as a kind of a homemade electronic music again.
Well, I can see when once I saw you perform a few times, and I started to do a little bit of research on David Tudor and watch what I can and listen to what I could find. I could really see how David Tudor has his electronic works have influenced what you've been doing with your personal.
Yeah, sure. No, that's very true. And I, at one point, got access to his instruments and was able to study them directly, and now get to sort of do real scholarship about his work instead of just being a fanboy. And get to be sort of a part of the network of people who are, close to the subject. My colleague is publishing a book about David Tudor that will be, published by Oxford University Press and probably bought by 15 libraries in the world and read by 10 people. But it's still a fantastic opportunity, and I'm super excited about it. There's an accessibility to, despite maybe that his work seems sort of rarefied and strange, there's a do-it-yourselfness to it that I think everybody can relate to. The idea that somebody would feel that strongly about making electronic music that they'd go to the newsstand and pick up surplus parts and build something. I think that's a beautiful idea. Nowadays, we have the opportunity to buy 100 different oscillators or 100 different VCAs or envelope generators. But what if we had to make them all ourselves? It's a different, it's a different world.
What I find fascinating is, I get to peek at your notes every now and then. Certainly when we're in California prepping for NAMM, because you always spend a day before doing some research, and you'll show me bits and pieces of the notes. And what I always found fascinating mostly about it is, because it seemed like he documented everything.
Oh, he documented everything.
Is that you can as you look at these drawings, you can watch him learning how to do this stuff, and you can really see he started by not knowing anything.
He didn't know anything, no.
And some of his solutions are awkward and sort of broken in their own, but that's kind of the magic of it.
Yeah, it's sort of beautiful to watch somebody learn and to eventually succeed in a big way. But he had an exceptional mind and an exceptional kind of a stubbornness, a perseverance. There's a story about him and John Cage where they bought spice in the 40s or 50s, I guess the 50s. They bought spices that were sent to them from Asia somewhere. Spices that you could only get in Asia, because in America you couldn't buy that kind of stuff then. So they got some big crate of spices. And when it arrived, the crate had been broken, and all of the containers, they were like glass containers or whatever, they had all shattered. And so the spices were all mixed, right? It was just all these powders. And he and John Cage each ordered they went in on it, and John Cage put his portion aside, was like just crestfallen, and he said, I'm just going to go do something else. And David Tudor got like little scales and sieves and tweezers and spent like a week separating out the powders into all the different, separating the chili from the coriander.
Oh,
because that was his mentality, is that he would actually like try to solve a problem like separating powdered spices from one another.
If only I had a week.
had a week to separate the sandy loam from the loamy sand. Yeah.
What I could do.
It's incredible, right?
But that's it. I think that that really highlights his personality and showcases his mentality really well. In addition to being just a fantastically silly story.
But it's an inspiration too, because it basically says even if you feel like you're not suited to doing something, if you give yourself the permission to make 1,000 mistakes, then maybe you are suited to do it.
Yeah, well, and bringing that then back to electronic design, certainly synthesizer design, that's what we're trying to do is you get to the point where you can make a mistake, and because if you don't, you're never gonna do anything interesting. You have to push too far to know where the limits are, or to know where you need to start working on something.
Yeah, that's very true, I think. And you also have to sort of evaluate your mistake and see, well, what's interesting about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Not just as like, don't go there anymore and like put up a big red sign saying don't ever travel in this direction, but maybe you learn something from it and maybe it actually makes something else better. Because a lot of the best ideas in electronic music, or even in other sort of fields, sometimes good ideas come from big mistakes, where you find out that big mistake you exploited in some way, and it becomes... It's silly, what's that joke, like is it a fault or is it a feature? Mm-hmm. But sometimes it really does become a feature, like a good one or whatever.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. So, tell us a little bit, just briefly, so to put in context, and the reason why we're talking about David Tudor here, tell us a little bit briefly about the work that you do with that, and why you find it relatively interesting. Or I feel like maybe we covered that half of it, or we could talk about something else.
Well, yeah, we covered it reasonably well. I would say I would like to describe the scale of Tudor's work. So he, in the course of his career, when he died, there were roughly 400 or 500 instruments left behind. Maybe about half of them were commercial devices that would like be carefully selected. Like he really liked certain commercial devices. Later in his career, he used almost exclusively guitar pedals. So out of that 500, maybe 200 or so were homemade, either by him or by friends of his, or sort of homemade engineer types. So a lot of interesting people would have made him something. He possessed one of the first, Don Buchla's first panner device, for instance. You saw that one, right? The quad panner.
Oh yeah, I saw that when you brought that one.
This crazy touch panel thing. So Don Buchla made that. Every time we show that to somebody, they say, "Oh, I've never seen one of these." Mark Verbos, who is a well-known expert on Buchla equipment, maybe the expert on Buchla equipment, says, "Oh, I've never seen that before." And he insisted that I open it up and show him the back of it. So that's stuff that people would be familiar with. But the idea of sort of, I learn a lot from the past, I guess. I get excited to see how other people solve problems, whether they solve problems just for themselves or whether they try to do something commercial. I never think an idea is too old, I guess.
That's good. It certainly feels like a lot of this stuff. Well, analog synthesis in general, it's kind of a timeless topic.
Yeah, I got over what did we say like a couple years ago? We have to stop feeling bad about analog.
Yes, yes.
Like I think we have a healthy attitude now that analog approaches and digital approaches can exist side by side, and we can use all of the history of electronics to make music, because anything that makes an interesting sound is fair game, whether it's transistors, software, or vacuum tubes. There are 1,000 cool ideas that we haven't done with like phonograph records yet. You know what I mean? Like I don't think we're done with the phonograph record. It's one of the crudest technologies there is, but it's a really simple and a very beautiful idea.
I know. Right. You can't see it, but right here is. I love that stuff. I think there's anytime you can add a physicality to music, it just heightens the experience, whether it be while you're listening with a record player or whether you're performing with an analog instrument or a record player as part of your performance. I think anytime you add a physicality, a tangible object to what you're doing that you can interact with, that's giving you feedback based on what you're doing in real time, it's a critical part of this art form that we're participating in.
Musicianship that's entirely in the head is hard. Do you know what I mean? Because that's really like the other end of the spectrum. It's like where if it's not in your hands or in your muscles, or in some kind of an instinct to move some part of your body, tapping your toe, or there's a reason that babies dance instinctively, right? If it's not in those places, then it has to be just in your head, and that's really hard to pull off.
And I don't think personally, as an artist to whatever extent I am, I don't find that terribly interesting. To me, performing and making music or making sounds is a conversation that I'm having with the instrument. So I need that physical feedback. I need that sonic feedback. I need a tangible result from what I'm doing.
But you get ideas from it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I end up having a conversation with the instrument that I'm working with because I need that to be the other half of my band, so to speak.
Yeah, but I mean, anybody working within a creative medium will tell you the same thing. Like the idea that some people who draw or paint or play conventional instruments or whatever, they don't come to them with big ideas. They smear paint until it starts to look like something, and they get ideas from the materials. They get excited about a new tool they have. They get thrilled about their new guitar strings. It's the materials that matter because they get the ideas from them. You may superimpose your ideas a little bit on materials, but I think a lot of the best work comes from the materials. It comes from making a sound and listening to it and reacting to it, and then making another sound, changing your mind about it. And it's that, let's put it this way, if you couldn't hear what you were doing, you'd be making bad stuff. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. There was this guy who was kind of like the king of street photography in the 70s, Gary Winogrand, and he took these amazing photographs of people in their daily lives, but he had a real knack for finding people's unusual behaviors or capturing just the right moment. He was wonderful at it, and he would spend a lot of his days just photographing ordinary people doing things, but he had a knack for observation. And at one point late in his career, he stopped processing his film. he would still go out and shoot every day because it was like an instinct to him, but he stopped processing it and he stopped looking at it. And after he died, they processed like piles and piles of his film that he'd left behind, and they made contact sheets to look at it, and they were like, boy, these aren't very good. Because he stopped having the feedback. Right? He stopped looking at the work that he made, and it didn't come back into his head, through his eyes. He didn't see it again. He just saw it the first time. And it is like a music where, you're not really hearing it. I don't know. Maybe it's a bad analogy, but I think I think about that.
I think it's a good example because you're not learning from what you're doing, and you're not guided at that point at all. You're simply following your instincts and what you remember from the past. But as things change and things evolve, and you don't, you end up getting off track, and so it makes a ton of sense that it wouldn't be as interesting or as good as it was in the past, because there's no more feedback left.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe that's we've been going.
You want to talk about that envelope generator now?
Yeah, we could go through the
feature set.
Let's go back in the live chat here. Someone had mentioned. Let me find it. I thought it was a very good question. Let me pull it up here. It may have been in the previous. It may have been in the previous chat. I think it was in the previous chat. Dang it. That's a bummer.
It's all right.
But the question, if I remember it correctly, was, isn't the envelope generator the most important circuit?
Yes.
I have to agree with that.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. Do you want to explain why?
I don't think we need to. I think if
it's the most important.
If you're watching this,
then
you know why.
You know why.
You know why it is.
We're talking to you.
Does anybody have...
you know what else is the most important circuit?
Which one?
All the other ones.
No, some of them aren't that important. Some of them are. So this is what happens when we get derailed from the topic here. Mm-hmm. We just go off the rails. Suit and Tie Guy's here. Hello, Suit and Tie Guy.
Oh, wow.
Thanks for showing up. Does anybody have... so I guess we really didn't have a list of things we wanted to cover today. It was really just to see if we could do this and see if it was interesting at all. Because sometimes Michael and I get together and we don't say a whole lot because we have stuff to do. And sometimes we just jibber jabber on for hours and hours. Tonight seems like we had a nice conversation. Fortunately, we did it on camera. Of course, it took us an hour and a half to set up all the cameras. But, it was clearly worth it. So do you guys have any questions you guys might have before we sign off here? One thing, as I'm waiting for the chat to sort of catch up with me talking, is I am going to take both part 1 and part 2 of this offline. I'm going to smash them together in Final Cut and then upload them as one piece. So later on, if you missed part 1 of this, you'll be able to catch it in one large chunk. But other than that, that's kind of that. I'm going to work on, see if I can figure out a way to get my stream a little more solid. I think that's just the idea that I've decided to stream at the same time my entire neighborhood wants to watch Netflix. So that's probably the problem with that. Analog granular synthesis and Michael's sequencing methods. Patching labs using the microvolt. Also, you would like to request the macrovolt. The macrovolt's not going to happen. If you've seen the pictures on the
macrovolt, there was at one point we were going to have a midvolt.
A midvolt, yeah. Well, originally there was going to be the small, the medium, and then the large one, and the small one ended up being the microvolt, and then the medium one, which was called the voltage lab.
Yeah,
that one, and I've shown pictures of that on Instagram. We didn't make it, and the reason we didn't make it is that the microvolt didn't sell very well. So we thought, well, why are we going to make a bigger version of a synthesizer already no one's really that interested in for whatever reason? So for that reason, we didn't do it. And we sort of shifted gears and we did the Voltage Lab. And I think was the right decision all day long, because the Voltage Lab turned out to be a really special instrument. The analog granular synthesis. Analog granular synthesis is difficult. I'm not sure. How would we do analog granular synthesis? I guess you could do it with a bunch of analog delays, sort of infinitely feeding back.
Oh boy!
To create. I think that's a good example of some things work really, really well digitally that don't work in the analog domain. And that's why having both available in your tool set is fantastic. The idea that you can do some really interesting stuff digitally that you can't do in the analog world, I think is great. And vice versa. I think there's a lot of stuff you can do in the analog world that you can't do digitally. I don't think granular synthesis is something that would really work in the analog realm. It would just, I'm sure someone could figure out how to do it. The problem is the circuit would be so large.
Yeah, but it's like the first, the first pocket calculator, the first calculator, right? A calculator in the old-fashioned sense is something that what they called a four-banger. It means it does add, subtract, multiply, divide. Mm-hmm. So the first calculator that they built out of vacuum tubes to do those four functions was the size of a house. Right, and then like within, 20 years or something like that, the pocket calculator those functions could fit into a device that you could put in your pocket, operate on a 9-volt battery, and it was the size of a pack of cigarettes. Right, and so like analog granular synthesis today, to do it something similar to the scale that we do digital granular synthesis would require like a house full of electronics or something like that. It's just not practical.
No.
It's like anybody who's ever tried to tune one of those sequential circuit synths that has 5 oscillators in it will tell you why we're not going to do analog granular synthesis.
Yeah, agreed. Now there are ways to approach it.
The basic ideas are good.
Yeah. But it's not. I think
what analog does well is what mathematicians call elegance. And elegance is like the simple thing that's really clean and smart. Right? And what computers do well is not the elegant thing, but the brute force thing. The you throw sheer numbers at a problem, and you can do it with incredible speed. It's the computer is the thing that can look through, 10,000 pages of data and find the one comma that's out of place. But that's not elegant. That's brute force. Analog is good at like the simple, elegant thing. I can make a pretty clean sine wave, or jack it up in some interesting way. But analog isn't about power. Analog's about simplicity in a way, I think.
Well, analog. I think what we've found in working what we're working on currently, the oscillator that we're working on, and even talking about the Voltage Lab, is if you take these small bits and add them together. So the Voltage Lab, I think, does this very, very well, where we have, your basic geometric waveforms, but then we run them through so many processors. I think there's, depending on which waveform you're using in the Voltage Lab, there could be 7 or 8 wave shapers in the signal path at any one given time.
Right.
And I think analog does that very well, where you
analog does that beautifully.
Yeah.
And it's because analog, when it's done right, has characteristics that are similar to wood and plastic and air and plaster and things like that, because it inherently puts curves on things.
Yeah.
And that's why all that wave shaping eventually can give you a waveform that doesn't look like a triangle no more, but it starts to look all jacked up and sound kind of nice, right? Because that's the way the sounds of real life look when you look at them.
Yeah, and that leads towards this idea that we've been working towards, this organic analog synthesis, which is let's worry less about having these perfect geometric shapes that we then run through a filter, but let's focus more on what's the end result and how can we make it sound of the room or of the space that you're in and feel. And like I was talking about before, in having a conversation with the instrument as I perform with it, having the sounds sound more organic and more natural is just one step closer to feel like I'm performing with the instrument and not using the instrument to perform.
Yeah.
Okay.
What you say is true.
So no granular synthesis. Envelope generators are the most important thing. Let's see what else.
Got that. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions in here? Where do I think Eurorack is going to be in 15 to 20 years? Oh,
I know where it'll be in 20 years, but not in 15.
Yeah, I can't forecast 20 years out, but 15 years, I think we've got a pretty solid foundation on what's going to... No, who knows?
No.
I'm hoping that we have some interesting ideas for what it's going to be in the next 2 to 3 years. But beyond that, I have no idea. It'll probably be really, in 15 to 20 years, it'll probably be super digital. Or maybe digital will be analog then. I don't know. That's not a question for me. I'm not a futurist.
Yeah, I don't. I think. Well, I think the healthiest situation is where you develop a relationship with a technology that you don't feel like you're following it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Like
you're not just sort of following, waiting for a new thing, but that you might get really excited about the equipment you have right now, but add, like a rubber band to your setup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, I think that's a healthy attitude where you feel like you're in control of your tools and you're making conscious decisions and not sort of hoping that somebody brings you something so special in 10 years that you're going to finally feel great about your music. You should feel great about it now because it's probably pretty cool.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. And enjoy the stuff that you have and use it well. And don't be hard on yourself.
Well, ultimately, these are all just tools.
Yeah.
For me, and what I hope to project out with the products that we design is that these are tools to allow you to get what's in your head out and use what you have to do that, because ultimately for 98% of the people out there, this is a hobby. This is not a profession. So any tool you have to be creative and to be artistic is the most important tool you could use. It doesn't, so what's going to be out there in 15 to 20 years? I don't know, but I'm sure it'll be just as creative and just as interesting, but just wildly different.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun working on tools, but, the world isn't dependent on us making better tools.
No.
We're not going to make music better necessarily because of the tools we make, but we might make it more fun for some people.
Yeah, and hopefully we can push analog into different areas or areas that maybe didn't get the research or the looks in the past that we felt it deserved. But that's, we're taking small steps. Do I think the Microvolt would have sold better if it had been rackable? If it had been a Eurorack module, it would have absolutely sold better. I think that was a big problem we had, is we're not known as a synthesizer manufacturer. We're known as a Eurorack synth manufacturer. So when we tried to get out of that little bubble with our marketing department of nobody and our marketing budget of $0 to spread the word that we're doing this. I think that was the problem, because the instrument, I think, is a lovely instrument. It sounds beautiful, but it's not a clone of anything, and it doesn't have an obvious, hey, if you like this well-known instrument, you'll like the Microvolt. And because of that, I think it struggled to find an audience, which is a shame.
If it were a Eurorack module, it would be a different shape, and it wouldn't be as fun to play.
That's absolutely true, and it would have been a totally different instrument, because we would have made different design decisions.
I'm teaching a synthesizer class right now, basically about using synthesizers, and I'm using the Microvolt as one of the instruments, and people are picking it over other instruments because they enjoy it. Like, it's not because they enjoy the sounds, but they enjoy the time they spend with it. Which, I guess what I mean is that the interface matters. They like the look and feel of it, and they can find their way around it with comfort. Where if it had been a Eurorack module, then it would have the way that you interact with it would have been very different.
Oh, I agree. I agree with that entirely. No, it was, every decision made for the Microvolt was made because we wanted to design a standalone instrument that someone could hook up a MIDI keyboard to or a controller to and perform with it, and not feel intimidated by the fact that this was a modular instrument. So we tried something interesting, and I think designed a beautiful instrument. The market wasn't as interested in it for whatever marketing reasons.
Yeah, the year that we made it with our marketing department of $0 and marketing budget of $0.
But I don't think that takes away from the instrument at all. I think it's a wonderful instrument. I'm extremely proud of it. I think it really showcased what we were interested in during that process. Because you have to remember, when we come out with an instrument, this is a year or two, or sometimes longer, of our lives that have gone into this. So we spent a year and a half working on the Microvolt. So I'm certainly not going to cast it aside and say, I think it sounds lovely, and I think there was a lot of really interesting ideas that went into that instrument. Let's see. We discontinued the binary filter. Is there a new filter module on the way? Yes. Yes, there is.
To the person who's asking, new to modular, why are envelope generators so important? They're not. We were joking. Envelope generators aren't any more important than anything else, which is not to say that they're not important. But if you're learning about modular synthesizers, as you say you're new to it, they have no greater importance than anything else.
No,
it was just a joke.
We were just being silly. How many Microvolts were made?
I don't know.
I want to say 400, maybe 500. I honestly can't remember off the top of my head. Out of that, how many have we sold? I don't know that either. I think we have I don't know. I can't even guess how many we have left. So I'm not going to try. I know we still have some left because we ship a couple out every week. So so I think that's going to be it for us today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my guest, Michael Johnsen. I certainly enjoy listening to him talk. He's one of my favorite people. So if I can convince him to come back, if you guys are interested, I will have him back and we will talk some more.
And next time we'll be in the same room. Wait, see, look, we're actually in the...
Yes.
That's my hand. Oh, wait, there.
All right. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Based on the feedback in in the live chat. I'm not gonna chop this up and put it back together as one thing, but I will clean it up a little bit as best I can using the YouTube editor. But thank you very much. We will do this again. I will be back with another one of these modular synthesis with Richard, Nicol, and somebody, whether it be Michael or somebody else, next Tuesday at 8:30. I'm going to try to do these every Tuesday night at 8:30 with a rotating guest and try to keep it interesting. Other than that, I will be back probably either Wednesday or Thursday with another patch. And I'm just going to keep doing this. So thank you guys for watching, and I will talk to you all later. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
See you guys later.
Bye. We'll pretend that's
Of course, it's not centered anymore.